Kaisel was a miserable, pathetic loser that got mocked by his friends for being the weakest knight around. His life took a dramatic turn when an ancient mage revealed that he was the son of a king who saved the world. So Kaisel got accompanied by some powerful allies as he went on a journey to find his father's overpowered sword. 100 years ago, the king of Orvelia, Kyle, wielded his holy sword named Ea in a dark realm, and battled the demon king Angmund, who looked like one of the aliens from A Quiet Place. After dodging and blocking several of Angmund's attacks, Kyle plunged towards Ogmund and landed the finishing strike. In the present day, Kaisel had a sparring match with his pal, Claws, and Claws gave him the full wiki treatment, easily countering his shitty attacks before telling him he'd never become a full-fledged knight with those predictable moves. Kaisel replied that he wasn't aiming to be a full-fledged knight, but rather a knight that would protect everyone. So Claws told the wannabe Jon Snow to put his money where his mouth is and beat him in their sparring match. Kaisel charged at him intensely, but Claws easily swept him to the ground before he could do shit. Claws then lectured him on how being too straightforward with his attacks could get him cooked one day, but Kaisel tried to strike him again. After blocking Kaisel's desperation strike easily, Claws boasted that Kaisel could never beat him. So Kaisel got ticked off and tried desperately to land a hit on him, while spouting some crap about how he'd rise above the taller and much more talented Claws. Claws easily blocked him again and put him down with a strike to the ribs before telling Kaisel, as well as the two knights that were spectating, Gran and Flag, to get back to work. Afterwards, Kaisel met up with Gran and Flag, and after they teased him for being a pathetic loser, they gave him some inspiring words about how he was a hard worker who'd definitely get stronger if he worked on his technique and stamina, before ultimately billing him to lunch for that afternoon. As the two guardian knights, Flag and Kaisel, patrolled the town of Orvelia, they had a friendly chat before running into a dark elf named Rahit. Rahit gave Kaisel the stink eye and walked past them like they were a bunch of street dogs. As he moved along, the surrounding villagers told Kaisel and Flag to throw him out, but Kaisel said he didn't do anything yet. So some other NPC-looking folks said that Rahit was certainly up to some evil stuff, because dark elves are known to be bad omens. Flag calmed them down by promising to report the situation to his superiors and asked Kaisel to return to their base since it was his break period, before promising the people that the Guardian Knights would maintain the peace in their town. Kaisel met up with a gorgeous priestess named Frey on his way back, and she brought up how they hadn't seen each other in a long time before asking how he's holding up. Kaisel said he was doing okay because he had Claws working with him, and Frey then said she was worried that he'd eaten something strange that had upset his stomach again. Kaisel tried to deny that claim, but she brought up how he always ate weird shit like centipedes and spiders, and like the ignorant turd that he is, Kaisel argued that eating those were normal. They then reminisced about the good old days in their childhood where they used to spend all day hunting insects alongside Claws, and Frey said Kaisel had nerves of steel back then before claiming he was working hard as a knight. Kaisel, however, didn't feel like taking a victory lap after getting complimented by a pretty girl, as he complained about being stuck in apprentice level. He told her he felt useless about being unable to stop the incident in town earlier that day, so she motivated him to finish his apprenticeship soon so he could be the next Kirito. Kaisel replied that he valued being a knight that could protect everyone over being an overpowered Rizlord, so Frey said he hadn't changed. Sometime later at the castle, the chancellor named Bale met up with the king, who was a bedridden old fart, in his bedroom, and informed him that there were demons sighted in a neighboring forest called the King's Forest. After Bale said he'd send scouts towards the area, the king commanded him not to let a single demon enter Orvelia, while hinting that the city couldn't handle the horrors that existed 100 years ago. Then some noble named Moraham showed up with Rahit at the castle and told the guards that were trying to stop Rahit that they were there on some serious business. Sometime later, some nobles were discussing the issue of demons, and when they started arguing over how many soldiers to send out, Moraham showed up and introduced Rahit as his soldier. The nobles started chewing him out for bringing a dark elf into the castle, so he gaslighted them into accepting Rahit by revealing that there were no laws forbidding dark elves from entering the castle. Then they asked why Moraham stopped by, so Moraham explained that he was there to recommend Rahit as well as his band of fierce mercenaries called the Black Edge to join the troops being sent on the demon hunt. He added that Rahit, who led the Black Edge, was capable of taking on 100 men alone, not in bed of course, so the nobles were shocked. Baal then asked Rahit why he agreed to help them despite the beef between Orvelia and the Dark Elves, so Rahit said they were men for hire who didn't give a crap about who hired them. When asked what his team desired as a reward, Rahit said they wanted nothing more than cash for their services, and Moraham praised his people for being honest and trustworthy, while throwing shades at the other nobles in the room for being power-hungry conmen. He then begged the chancellor to hire the Black Edge, but he and all the other nobles opposed the idea, so he apologized and took the L. That evening, the knights were stunned to see that Kaisel had prepared an insect for his dinner, and they ate and chatted with each other before Claus informed Kaisel about the demons in the king's forest, and said that he, as well as Gran and Fleg, would be going on the mission to hunt them. Kaisel suddenly remembered a traumatic event from his past involving a lady, and started feeling down about it, so they cheered him up and told him to keep training when they were gone. Later that night, the Black Edge elves arrived at the village and killed an innocent guy before meeting in a hidden location and discussing their plans to kill the nobles and take control of the nation. The next day, Claus and the rest of the knights left for the king's village to find the demons, and afterwards Kaisel trained tirelessly for several days while waiting for their return. A knight that Kaisel patrolled with told him the demon hunt scouts were taking too long, but Kaisel said they'd be fine since Claus was with them. Meanwhile, Claus and the rest of the knights were patrolling the forest when they were suddenly ambushed by some demons. The demons killed Fleg with a stream of arrows, and Claus sent Gran to report their situation to the castle, while fending off the demons with his sword skills. Eventually, Gran made it back to Orvelia, and the people were shocked to see just one scout returning. Gran reported to the nobles that the scouts encountered an unknown number of demons in the forest before passing out, and the nobles were ready to send more knights into the forest to burn that shit down. But Moraham said it'd be best to conserve their power since they could encounter a demon invasion like the incident from 100 years ago. The nobles asked what to do, so he suggested they use the Black Edge, and when the nobles debated it again, he told them to stop being whiny douchebags and asked the chancellor to make a decision. Meanwhile, Frey met up with Kaisel and asked about the scouts, so Kaisel said he was sure that Claus was fine and decided to go find him. Frey tried to stop him, reminding him that he was still an inexperienced knight, but he insisted on saving Claus and said he never wanted to lose anyone close to him again. Frey then said she'd go with him, and when he tried to stop her, she said she didn't want to lose anyone as well and added that her skills as a priestess would be useful to him, before revealing that Claus put her in charge of taking care of him. Meanwhile, at King's Forest, a lady with a weird marking on her head named Maria looked down at the pile of knights' corpses in front of her. When Kaisel and Frey got to the King's Forest, they saw a bunch of dead knights, and Kaisel freaked out when he noticed that Fleg was among them. Frey then went to say a prayer to send them off, and when Kaisel went forward to look for Claus, he saw Claus's shield on the floor and got scared. He lifted the shield up to find the bloody remains of a knight, and they were relieved to see that it wasn't Claus. When Kaisel moved forward, an arrow came flying towards Frey, so he immediately jumped back and saved her from the Hawkeye fanboy that was attacking them. Soon, a horde of demons appeared, and Kaisel was frightened after remembering the tragedy from his past, but told Frey to get the hell out of there and charged towards the demons. He crossed swords with one of the demons, but jumped back when another spear-wielding demon got involved. As Maria watched from the top of a tree, Kaisel told the demons to bring it on, so they fired more arrows at him, which he blocked with his stupidly large sword. Another demon charged towards him and tried slashing him to pieces, but Kaisel dodged all of its attacks and pushed the demons back with a slash of his own. He then tried to run off with Frey, but Maria appeared in front of them and asked to play with Kaisel, before unleashing a dark aura that slammed him to a tree. Frey rushed to check on him, and Maria wondered why Kaisel was such a weakling, despite resembling someone she knew to be strong. Then the surrounding demons fired arrows at Frey and Kaisel, but Frey blocked them with a magic shield. When the shield went off, a bunch of demons charged towards them, but before they could attack the duo, Rahit showed up and took them out with a single slash. Afterwards, 2 other members of Black Edge showed up and rushed to take on the demons, while Rahit faced Maria. The Black Edge elves took out the demons easily, and Rahit swiftly charged at Maria, relentlessly dodging her attacks while trying to land one of his own. Kaisel was amazed by Rahit's skills, and Maria praised him as well when they jammed blades before promising to face Kaisel one day and disappearing into a black mist. Soon, some other members of Black Edge arrived, and Rahit's sister named Ripine asked who the worthless pair was, so Kaisel introduced himself and thanked them for their help. The Black Edges revealed that they'd been hired to take out the demons, and Rahit asked what they were doing there, so Kaisel told him they were there to save their friend. Rahit said that all the scouts had been clapped, which was why they hired his squad, but Kaisel said he believed there were survivors. One of the defeated demons tried pulling off a surprise attack, but an elf easily lopped its head off before it could do shit, and the Black Edge left that area. Afterwards, Frey healed an injury on Kaisel's cheek with healing magic, and Kaisel once again whined about his lack of skills, bringing up how he couldn't defeat a single demon, and asking if he could ever protect anyone. Their conversation was cut short when 2 strange people showed up, and after telling Kaisel to put his sword down, the quirky girl among the duo introduced herself as Cleo, while the guy introduced himself as Roy, Cleo's babysitter. Cleo said he's her bodyguard and not her babysitter, and they goofed off a bit before revealing to Kaisel and Frey that they were there to look for them. Cleo then asked them to follow her, so they followed her all the way to the edge of a cliff, where Kaisel demanded to know what the hell was going on. Roy explained that they were asked by a certain person to bring them to that location, and when Kaisel asked who it was, Cleo said it was a guy named Dominix. Frey got shocked since she knew Dominix was a high-profile sorcerer, and when they asked how she knew him, Frey said he used to show up at the orphanage where she and Kaisel grew up. Cleo then suggested they move along, and when Kaisel asked where they were going, she said they were going up to a place called the Tower of the Sage. Frey was confused since she knew only chosen people get to enter that tower. But Cleo then revealed that she was a chosen one, and created a huge magic circle that teleported them away. Before long, they reached the gates of a magical city, and as they went inside, Cleo told them that most of the residents were either sorcerers or scholars training under the Great Sage. Frey asked what the Great Sage was like, so Cleo said he was an old freak who used magic to maintain his youth. Eventually, they met Dominix at the tower, and he told Frey and Kaisel that they were all grown up, but they said he hadn't aged a bit since they met him at the orphanage. Then Cleo revealed to them that he was the great sage she was talking about, and when Frey asked why he kept his identity hidden, Dominix said revealing it often caused him trouble. Kaisel then asked why they brought them to the city, so Dominix said he wanted them to see someone. Dominix took them to a room where Claus laid unconscious on the bed, and said that he wasn't fatally injured. Cleo and Roy then revealed that they jumped in to help the scouts after getting word of the demonic activity in the area, but saw that Claus was the only survivor. Frey asked if Dominix knew they were coming, so he said he'd been watching them from the tower, but just then Claus woke up and was surprised to see his friends were in the room. After they caught up, Claus told them about how the demons ambushed his squad from nowhere, and Kaisel told him that the demons had been taken out by the Black Edge. Kaisel added that Maria, whom he called a female demon, ran off, and while Claus was confused, Cleo revealed that Maria was actually a witch. Claus said he didn't see Maria since his scouts only fought the skeleton-looking demons, and on realizing that Maria wasn't connected to the demons, Frey and Kaisel tried to figure out who she was. Dominix then suggested they let Claus rest, and also that Frey and Kaisel stayed at his place for a while before asking Cleo to show them to their rooms. Cleo took Frey to her room and asked why she didn't want to stay in the same room with Kaisel. This got her all flustered as she explained that she and Kaisel weren't pillow buddies, so Cleo teased her a bit before suggesting they became friends. Frey agreed, so Cleo told her she also didn't have parents before chatting about what life in the city was like. The girls then stargazed through the window, and Frey noticed something weird going on outside their window before Cleo left her room. Frey later met up with Kaisel, who was sitting outside, and asked what he was up to. So Kaisel did what he did best and whined about how he didn't have enough power to join Claus's team in their fight against the demons. He then brought up an incident from his past where demons attacked his village and his mother died protecting him, before claiming he needed to get stronger so he could protect the people dear to him. The next day, Rahit met up with the nobles at Orvelia Castle and revealed that his team had taken out the demons, even bringing a demon's skull as proof of his claims. The nobles were shocked, and after a bit of argument with the nobles once again about relying on the elves, Morahem claimed that all races needed to unify to take down the demon race, the same way King Kyle worked with elves and orcs to defeat the Dark Lord 100 years ago. Baal then thanked Rahit for his efforts, but told him to get rid of the demon head since it could scare the people. Later that evening, Morahem and Rahit had a laugh about how the nobles wet themselves at the sight of a demon skull before Morahem brought up his goal to take the chancellor position from Baal in order to take over the nation, and they toasted to their future. The next day, Claus said he needed to get back to Orvelia as soon as possible, so Kaisel and Frey tried to get him to relax, but he claimed he needed to defeat the demons for everyone he lost during their mission. Cleo then stopped by and said that Dominix summoned Frey and Kaisel, and when they met up with him, he asked if Kaisel's mother ever told him about his father. When he said he didn't know anything, Dominix revealed that Kaisel was the son of King Kyle, and that he was to inherit the sacred sword Ea, which was used to kill the Dark Lord. Kaisel said it was a lie since his mother died when he was young and Kyle hadn't been alive for 100 years, but Dominix offered to explain everything. Sometime later, the Black Edge elves had a meeting, where one of them named Tam brought them all some food, and when he gave Ripine her own piece of bread, she complained that Orvelian foods were too salty. Tam agreed to disagree on that point, and then brought up how 100 years ago, during King Kyle's era, the elves were allowed to live in Orvelia, and one other Black Edge elf said that the reason elves were currently treated garbage was because of an elf named Ilya. The elf beside him said not to bring up Ilya, as it could rock off Rahit, but Rahit agreed to that point, and said that Ilya is the reason elves are prosecuted. Meanwhile, back at the tower, Dominix told Kaisel and Frey about the time Kyle was prince. Back then, Kyle had a sparring match with Ilya, which he overpowered her within a short time, and when Ilya acknowledged how his skills improved, he praised her coaching skills before Dominix showed up and praised them both. Sometime later, the three of them had lunch together, and after Kyle's elder half-sister Ilya chewed him out for entering into town again, Kyle said that he intended to learn everything about the citizens of Orvelia by hanging out with them in the streets. He suggested that a nation can't exist without citizens, and that if royals did nothing but hoard power, the city would be in ruins, so he declared that he wanted to be a king that could protect the people and make them happy. Illy said she was sure he'd be a splendid king, and offered to assist him when he assumed that role with her knowledge of technomagic. Sometime later, Kyle met up with Dominix and asked him why people in the city lived in poverty despite living in a peaceful era. So Dominix explained that it was because their war with the neighboring nations lasted for a long period of time, adding that families that lost working-age members during war tend to go poor, and Kyle said the war was meaningless. After that, Kyle spent years studying and training to become a heroic king until he met a woman who shared his dreams named Arlette. Back in real time, Kaisel freaked out after hearing the name Arlette, and Dominix confirmed that the Arlette he was talking about was Kaisel's mom. Frey asked how Arlette was alive 100 years ago, but Dominix said he'd explain that later before telling them how Kyle and Arlette had their little Cinderella story together until the king and nobles found out about their relationship and forced them to separate. Dominix explained that Kyle was the king's successor, so Arlette became an obstacle for a politically arranged marriage, and added that Kyle's tragedies didn't end there, because demons soon appeared in the world. Dominix narrated how demons destroyed several towns and villages after invading the human worlds, and how Kyle and his army defeated them time and time again, until his father, Median, suddenly passed away, allowing him to ascend to the throne. During his coronation, Kyle acknowledged the troubling state the region was in due to the invasion of demons, and declared that he'd defeat every single demon and protect his people. Sometime later, King Kyle formed an alliance with Lorraine of the Elves and Iatola of the Orcs in order to defeat the demons, but during the war, they got outnumbered by demons and King Kyle ended up getting injured. In a shelter, Kyle met up with his senorita Arlette, who was already carrying baby Kaisel inside her, and Kyle was really pleased to find out he'd have a child. Kyle named the unborn child Kaisel, and decided to protect the world for his unborn child, and in response to his wish, the goddess of light Lua appeared and gave him the holy sword Ea to save the world from the Dark Lord Angmund. Kyle later told Lorraine, Dominix, and Iatola that the Dark Lord would attack when a red ring covers the moon, and assured them that he could defeat him with Ea before asking for their help. Back in real time, Dominix told Kaisel and Frey about how Ilia devoted herself to studying technomagic, and then they brought up how Ilia was known to have been executed for attempting to create a false holy sword. Dominix explained that the people of Orvelia saw it as a blasphemous challenge against Lua. So Frey asked why Ilia intended to make a false holy sword in the first place. Dominix then explained that she intended to fulfill her promise of helping Kyle with her studies, and explained that when a red star called the Nocturnal Sun caused a red glowing ring around the moon by intersecting it, a mage named Malduk used forbidden magic to tear open a dimensional fissure, which brought Angmund to the human world. Dominix said that King Kyle went off to face Angmund alongside his companions, while Ilia finished her research, but she was killed by demons before she could reach Kyle to make the assist. He added that after Kyle defeated Angmund with the help of his comrades, they both disappeared, leaving only the holy sword Ea behind. After that, demonic activities in the world died down and peace returned to the world, but Maldek escaped and Kyle was nowhere to be found. Kaisel said Kyle was a brave king for risking his life to save everyone, and Dominix agreed to that, before revealing that the holy sword Ea was sealed away by his companions, who decided to hold the key to seal until the Dark Lord returns, so humanity could use the power of Ea once more. He explained that back then, after Ilia's death, she was put under trial and found guilty of defiling Lua, and as a result, the entire elven race were persecuted. Back at the Black Edge hideout, Tam asked Rahit if Ilia knew her actions would later affect the Dark Elves, and later said he wished to go back in time so he could save his parents from getting killed and give Ilia a Detroit smash for causing it. Rahit then said that all that ancient shit didn't matter because in the present, elves were still persecuted, and he once again claimed to settle the score with Orvelia. Meanwhile, at the tower, Kaisel asked Dominix to tell him about his mother and what she was up to during those epic events, so Dominix explained that back then, they knew only Kyle's descendants could use Ea, and they feared that Malduk could summon Angmund again 100 years later during another red ring moon, so they put Arlette to sleep. Dominix said that Arlette woke up 100 years later and gave birth to Kaisel, before demons invaded their village and killed her. He then revealed that he was the one who sent Kaisel to the orphanage, since he didn't have any parents or place to live. Dominic said that he visited Kaisel during his stay at the orphanage to watch Kaisel's growth, and that he had no doubt that he was Kyle's son, before revealing that another red ring moon was coming soon, which meant the Dark Lord could soon be back as well. Kaisel said he wasn't fully convinced that he was Kyle's son, but said he needed the Holy Sword so he could protect everyone, and asked Dominix how he could get it. Dominix said he had to break the seal, which meant he had to go meet the Grand Sage of the Forest of Elidora, Lorraine, and said he couldn't accompany them because he couldn't leave the tower. Dominix then called Cleo and Roy, who were eavesdropping on their conversation, into the room and assigned them to join Kaisel on his mission. Cleo was really excited about it, and she promised to keep Kaisel safe before Dominix told Frey to do the very same thing for the pea-brained knight. Afterwards, Kaisel and Frey filled Claus in on everything he'd learned about himself, as well as his mission to find the Holy Sword. Kaisel claimed he wanted to wield it to protect everyone, so Claus wished him luck and promised to take care of Orvelia while he goes on his journey. The next day, Kaisel, Frey, Cleo, and Roy left the tower, and after teleporting back to the cliff, Maria watched them from the nearby forest and smiled mischievously. Eventually, the team made it to the forest of Elidora, and Cleo got grumpy about the fact that they were going to a forest and not a NASA space trip. She then called Kaisel a fraud and said there was no way a weasel like him could be the son of the legendary king, and Kaisel said he didn't believe so as well. Cleo then went further with her taunts by saying Kaisel wasn't heroic at all, and Frey said she believed that the goddess Lua would guide them. But then a group of demons made a surprise entrance and blocked their way. Roy immediately dashed forward to face them alone, and when Kaisel and Frey attempted to stop him, Cleo said he'd be fine. Roy then pulled out a pair of blades and sliced up the demons like a couple of leftover veggies before another horde of demons appeared, this time wielding arrows. Before the demons could fire their arrows, they were taken down using brutal green arrow-style backshots from an elf named Selene. Kaisel and the gang rushed in and introduced themselves, so she told them she'd been waiting for them and offered to guide them to Lorraine. As they walked into the forest, they saw that it was dark and creepy looking, and soon a tree monster called a Treat walked past them. They asked Selene to introduce herself, so she acted like an arrogant half-wit before doing so, and revealing that she was following Lorraine's orders to bring Kaisel to her, which made the rest of the team feel worthless. They continued their stroll, and Roy noticed they were being watched before they started hearing some voices that called Selene a princess, and as well suggested the team backed off from the forest. Selene then confirmed that she was the princess of the region, and when the voices didn't stop with their insults, Cleo dared the creeps to show them to come out and insult them to their faces. Selene then explained that the land was sacred to elves, and that the people weren't keen on welcoming humans, so Kaisel said he had no problem with elves and asked to move ahead. After a bit of walking, they reached a point with 2 tunnels where Selene suddenly disappeared. They chased after her in the tunnel that seemed like the right path, but it ended up leading them to a cliff in the middle of nowhere, and after the tunnel closed up, Cleo revealed to them that elves and treats of Elidora loved playing tricks on travelers and making them lose their way. Meanwhile, Selene looked back and noticed Kaisel and friends weren't behind her, so she ordered the residents of the forest to reopen the tunnel for them to come back. They weren't convinced, so she begged them, saying she as well didn't trust them, but Lorraine wished to see them. On the cliff, a baby treat named Necha met up with the gang and guided them back to Selene in the forest. Selene tried to warn Necha to stay away from them, but it ended up joining them on their walk, and they goofed off on the road a bit before Selene said they should rest for the night and continue their trip the next day. Afterwards, they set up camp and Kaisel played around with Necha for a bit, so they noticed the little one had taken a liking to him, but instead of "I am Groot," this little tree monster only knew how to say the word "Chibai," so they called him that. Selene then asked Kaisel who he was, so he replied that he was a nobody who didn't have power to protect anyone, which was why he needed to meet Lorraine to gain that power. A while later, Selene left them to take a look around, and the team goofed off a bit before Cleo implied that King Kyle was special since he was chosen by Lua. But Kaisel was less of a hero because he was born into inheriting the sword. Roy then told Kaisel not to listen to her, and said he needed to fight without hesitation or doubting himself, and Kaisel said he needed the power of the sword so he could protect everyone. Cleo then asked what the sword's power was, and despite not knowing jack about the sword's abilities, they figured it would be a powerful weapon since it could defeat the Dark Lord. Cleo then brought up how the Dark Lord had only appeared once in history, which was during the fight against Kyle and company, implying that they managed to stop him because they made it in time, so everyone decided they had to get the Holy Sword to stop the Dark Lord in the case of his return. Meanwhile, Selene was somewhere else in the forest, thinking about how Kaisel was different from the vile stories she'd heard about humans, and then she heard a loud noise and rushed to meet Kaisel and the gang. They all ran towards the wreckage and saw that a certain treant had gone berserk, so they were confused since treants were known to be peaceful creatures. They then saw a demon knock down the treant with its tentacle, and Selene tried attacking the demon with an arrow, but it blocked her shot easily. Necha saw the treant's life fade into the abyss, and he rushed towards the demon to get revenge, but the demon grabbed him and crushed him using its tentacles. Cleo thought about using flame magic to barbecue the demon, but discarded the idea when she realized she'd be roasting Necha as well. Kaisel charged towards it, but the demon knocked him away easily, and when he tried attacking again, Selene fired some arrows that saved him from the demon's tentacles. Selene told Kaisel to escape since it didn't concern him, but Kaisel said they couldn't leave Necha behind, and the whole team attacked the monster at once. Eventually, the demon grabbed hold of Kaisel as well, but Necha launched a wooden blade at the monster, and saved him from getting destroyed by the demon's acid before getting torn apart by the demon. Seeing the beloved Necha being reduced to shreds, everyone went into shock, but Kaisel got engaged and attacked the demon relentlessly until he killed him. Kaisel's rampage didn't stop after killing the demon, as he kept slashing the beast's corpse, and Selene eventually held him back and said he'd done enough for Necha. Kaisel broke down afterwards, and Selene looked back to see Lorraine watching from afar. Kaisel washed his face in the nearby river after spilling about 2 buckets to tears before Lorraine met up with him and thanked him and the rest of the gang for saving the forest of Elidora. Kaisel was still feeling grumpy about losing Necha, so she comforted him by saying she was sure he had a great time with Kaisel and the guys before giving a speech about the cycle of life and other mystical bullshit. She then went to the point and asked why Kaisel came by, so he said he intended to ask her to unseal the Holy Sword. Selene was surprised about the fact that Kaisel was the sword's heir, and Lorraine said she couldn't undo the seal at that moment. She explained that if she unsealed it, the power of the Holy Sword would flow into Kaisel, and asked if he was worthy of that power. Kaisel then said he needed the power, but she said that the Holy Sword wasn't a cheap glow stick, as it had the power to defeat the Dark Lord, and warned him that it could destroy his body and soul if he didn't wield it properly. Kaisel said he didn't care what happened to him, claiming he needed power to protect everyone, so Lorraine said she understood how he felt and said they'd continue the discussion the next day. Later that evening, Selene took them to a place she called Lorraine's residence and said they'd sleep there for the night, but before she could leave, Frey called her back and requested that she bury Necha's remains, which looked like a green racingen, in his favorite spot. Feline agreed and took them to a particular spot that used to be his playground. Lorraine made a surprise entrance and offered to assist with the funeral, so she used her magic to bore a hole in the ground, and everyone said kind words to Necha as they put him to rest in the ground. A while later, Lorraine met up with Selene and asked the corny princess if she thought Kaisel was fit to inherit the Holy Sword. Selene said she was unsure, So Lorraine said she needed Seleni's opinion since she'd spent time with Kaisel, and after remembering her time with Kaisel, Lorraine said she was still uncertain if he was fit to be their Luke Skywalker. Afterwards, Selene walked through the forest and wondered if Kaisel had what King Kyle had that drew others to follow him, and she felt he was doomed because he gave in to rage so easily during the tentacle demon fight. Then she saw him at Netch's grave spot, where Kaisel poured his heart out about how he regretted losing himself to anger and how he needed to get stronger. Then a little plant sprouted from Netch's grave, and while Kaisel was shocked, Selene explained that trees received new life after dying, but said it was unusual for it to happen that fast. She speculated that Netcha was trying to cheer them up, so Kaisel thanked Netcha and said that he wanted to get stronger. The next day, the gang met up with Selene and Lorraine asked Selene if she'd made her decision about Kaisel and his gang, so Selene said that despite all the slanderous stories about humans, this merry band of airheads selflessly jumped in to save the village of Elidora when the demon appeared, so she had a different opinion about humans. Lorraine then asked why Selene couldn't give her a certain answer the previous night, so Selene explained that she was worried since she felt that a guy that lost himself to anger like Kaisel would harm their forest one day, but ended up seeing that he knew his own flaws and sought true power, so she claimed that Kaisel was worthy of inheriting the power of the Holy Sword. Kaisel thanked her, and she blushed after getting hit with that wave of virgin riz before Lorraine commended her for being open-minded towards humans. Lorraine once again warned Kaisel about the sword's power and asked Kaisel if he aimed to inherit it, and as he agreed, she saw the same determination in his eyes that Kyle once had. The rest of the Airhead crew backed him up, saying they'd help out if things got messy. And Lorraine said she was sure he'd accomplish his goals the way Kyle did before telling Selena how she fought beside Kyle despite their differing races. Lorraine then agreed to undo the seal on the Holy Sword Ia, so she went closer to Kaisel and used a spell that connected Kaisel to the Holy Sword, thereby confirming his true status as the heir to the legendary weapon. Afterwards, Kaisel said he didn't feel more powerful, but Lorraine assured him that he'd feel the power soon enough, before revealing that the Holy Sword had two other seals, one being with Iatola, the leader of the orcs in Ogria Mountain, and the other being with someone named Pavel in the Windland Snow Mountain, which was even farther than Ogria Mountain. As the Airhead crew were about to continue their journey, they got an alert about more demons invading the area. When they got outside, they saw a swarm of demons, including the tentacle demon which they were shocked to see. But Cleo explained that demons could survive by leaving a seed behind when they die. Selene was ready to take the demons down using all the archery moves she learned from Hawkeye in the Avengers movies, but Lorraine stopped her and told her to watch Kaisel do his thing. Kaisel rushed towards the respawn tentacle demon and shocked everyone when he easily tore its tentacles apart, before landing a finishing strike which he claimed was vengeance for Netcha. Afterwards, Lorraine gave Kaisel some words of encouragement for his mission, and Selene told him that she trusted him and the crew even though she wasn't entirely sure about humans, so Kaisel and the Airhead crew waved them goodbye and left the forest of Elidora. Back at Orvelia, Moraham and Rahit were scheming as usual, and Moraham suggested that Rahit becomes a knight and outshines the other knights in order to forward their plans of toppling the nobles in the city. As the Airhead crew left Elidora, they discussed their goal of reaching Ogria Mountain, and Roy suggested they visit several towns along the way to get info and restock on supplies. Then the loudmouth of the group, Cleo, asked if they could call Kaisel a prince, but Kaisel said they should refer to him normally since he was just an average Joe, and Roy said it makes sense to hide his identity since he was from the past. Before long, Maria obstructed their journey, and immediately she showed up. They could feel her overwhelming magic power, and she gave them a hands-on experience of it as she blasted them with a dark wave. Kaisel immediately got in front and blocked her attack, so she commended him, but Kaisel then asked where her demon allies were, and she said the demons had nothing to do with her. Kaisel then asked what she wanted, so she appeared at his back in an instant, and said she wanted to play before trying to carve out his head. Kaisel stopped her attack and pushed her back, so she was stunned about his power upgrade, but when he pinned her down, she confirmed that he was using the power of the Holy Sword. She pushed him back and wondered how he could use Kyle's power, so Cleo told her that Kaisel was Kyle's son. Maria then said that the Holy Sword was Lua's curse, and that Kaisel had become Lua's puppet as well before vanishing into a mist of darkness. On their way to the Ogria Mountain, the gang moved towards a certain town, and Cleo was excited about visiting that town because it had so many great foods and locations, which made it a dream tourist spot for her. When they got into town, Cleo wasted no time before spending all of Frey's money on some street food. After stuffing their faces, Cleo suggested they visit some more fun spots, but they declined, so she gaslighted them with a heroic story about how the town survived a war 30 years ago, using the power of friendship. So Roy suggested they find an inn so they could rest before continuing their trip. They ended up going along with Cleo's sightseeing wishes, and at the end of it they realized that they had no cash left, so Cleo suggested they find a way to make money in town. She later found them a job at an inn where they were paid and given a free room in exchange for serving customers there, so all of them, with the exception of Kaisel, spent the day doing bar work. That evening, Kaisel was chopping up some wood and remembered Maria's parting words to him, so he wondered if the Holy Sword's power was truly a curse. Meanwhile, Cleo couldn't stop herself from showing off her magic to the surrounding maids, and ended up starting a fire at the bar. After getting kicked out of the bar, the crew were at a spot in town where Cleo was sulking, and Roy explained to Kaiser and Frey that Cleo was a wild child, because she had no experience with the outside world, and also told them about a time she blew up a building, which made Dominix to advise her to put her potential to good use. Frey then joined Cleo where she was resting, and Cleo apologized before saying she wished for an older sister like Frey. Frey was baffled, so Cleo explained that her mother died when she was little, and although she didn't remember her mother's face, she remembered how her mother twisted Spider-Man's quote, and told her that great power comes with great sadness. She said she often wondered what it meant and wished she could ask her mom, but Frey said she could understand what her mom meant if she practiced magic more, since she believed that Cleo and her mom were still connected. SHD Cleo fell asleep afterwards. The next morning, Kaisel and Frey woke up, but couldn't find Roy, but they stumbled onto a note which said he'd left to make some money for them. When Frey brought up how Cleo was missing as well, the pink-haired devil they spoke of showed up and said she'd found work for them in a restaurant on the outskirts of town, but she eventually noticed that Roy was missing. Roy was out peddling some of his fancy equipment, while the rest Kaisel and Frey followed Cleo to the outskirts restaurant, which didn't look like the Ice Guy version of KFC they were expecting. They met a scary-looking old hag named Madame Wolf, who instantly put them through tons of stressful work on them, and after seeing Cleo's magical ability, she put her through 1,000 times more work than the others. Afterwards, Cleo got into a yapping contest with the old hag, and afterwards Madame Wolf put her through some more nightmarish work, while mocking her in the process. When they were done with work, Madame Wolf treated them to a meal which they confessed was far better than all the road crap they'd been eating. She then told them that she hadn't cooked in a long time since people rarely showed up to her restaurant, and Kaisel suggested she do some advert, but she said she didn't mind since she cooked slowly using charcoal fire. Cleo was about to suggest making use of her flame magic, but she remembered what happened in the last restaurant and hesitated, but the Madame Wolf said she should absolutely desist from using flame magic in that area. They asked why, so she explained that the area, which used to be a big town, was razed down by a war which involved a lot of flames and demons that caused her loved ones to die, and she said the restaurant was all that remained in that area. She showed them a bunch of gravestones lined up outside, which were the former townsfolk, and said she absolutely didn't want flame magic to be used in that area again. Cleo argued that magic is used for saving people and not hurting others, but Madame Wolf said a mage tried protecting her people during the war, but it led to a great tragedy and Cleo saw the old hag shed a tear. A while later, Cleo looked at the graves and thought about her mother's words, wondering if this was the great sadness she was referring to. But then a horde of demons showed up, and Cleo noticed that some demons were already closed to the restaurant. Casel told Frey to take care of Madame Wolf and knocked out a demon knife as he ran out to face the rest of the demons. Frey told Madame Wolf to escape through the back door while she covered the front, so the old hag ran off. Casel slashed up a bunch of demons, and soon he was joined by Cleo, who knocked a couple of them down with her staff. Eventually, the numbers game caught up to them, and Madame Wolf had to save Cleo by throwing a stone at a demon, inadvertently revealing her hiding spot in the process. As the demon approached Madame Wolf, Cleo tried to save her, but couldn't use her magic after remembering Wolf's tragic words, and on seeing this, Madame Wolf knew she'd messed up. The demons soon overpowered Cleo, so Madame Wolf yelled that she should use her magic, adding that the present is more important than the past. The demons tried attacking her again, but Frey protected her with a shield before Cleo used an epic spell to create a rain of fireballs that turned the demons into pork roast. Afterwards, she apologized to the madam, but the madam said it was okay since she was putting her life on the line for her friends, and the two hotheads embraced each other. Roy soon arrived at their location, so Cleo chewed him out for being late and told him about the demons they just fought. He showed her the pile of cash he made where they were playing around with the old hag, and before Cleo could get her hands on it, Frey grabbed their cash and offered to be the group's new treasurer. The next day, the crew left Madame Wolf's restaurant and Cleo now had clarity on what it meant to be a mage. Sometime later, the Black Hedge elves were flexing their skills on some 4 demons, and Ripine put the fight to an end as she ripped apart the last remaining demons around. Afterwards, Rahit reported to Milam that the mission was a success and Milam told him that Baal wants to see him before revealing that the kingdom was planning to launch a formal operation to hunt demons, which he claimed would give Rahit a chance to showcase his skills once again. Later that evening, Rahit eavesdropped as an astrologist named Ophelia told Baal and the princess Scarlet that the day of Lee, the goddess of darkness, was approaching, which involved the nocturnal sun crossing with the moon to bring terror on the world. She said that the stars whispered to her that the Dark Lord Angmund would show up during this terror, and Baal feared that the kingdom was cooked since Kyle wasn't around and their king was practically a vegetable, but Scarlet assured him that the knights would defend the kingdom. Scarlet said she'd never let the demon lord trample over Orvelia and told Ophelia to keep reading the stars, and as she made her way, Rahit came out to meet them. Baal introduced Scarlet as the princess as well as the commander of knights, and after Scarlet complimented his squad for all their hard work during the demon invasions, she proposed that Black Edge join the knights. Rahit humbly agreed, so she asked him to join the knights for a general meeting the next morning before leaving. When Rahit informed them that they'd be joining the knights, Tam was worried that it would affect their mission. So a sleazy elf in the group explained that it would make it easier for them to infiltrate and take over the kingdom. Rahit then announced that they'd have to be more alert and stay away from trouble, and when an elf asked about the princess, Rahit said she seemed like she'd be tough to handle. The next day, Scarlet briefed the knights about Ophelia's predictions, and when Rahit walked into the room, she officially announced to them that he and his squad would be joining the knights. One of the knights named Zero argued the issue by bringing up Ilia's matter, but Scarlet said it had nothing to do with Black Edge and asked if anyone disagreed with the decision. Everyone accepted the decision, and when she asked Zero if he was on board, he proceeded to act like a complete dirtbag as he mocked Rahit by suggesting he did some rat hunting and gave him a luxurious item as down payment. Rahit returned his expensive bullshit and told him that money wouldn't save him if demons broke into the town. Scarlet then declared that the Black Edge were their friends as of that day and forbade anyone from disrespecting them. She then resumed the meeting and asked a knight named Demia for some new info, so Demia said she got word of numerous demon sightings in the forest of Aludora. Scarlet then asked for Rahit's opinion, so he said they could send some scouts to investigate that area before suggesting that they reorganize the defending knights to be able to protect more people, and although Zero felt like poking his ears out, Scarlet liked Rahit's ideas. Rahit was so disgusted by the idea of dark elves joining the knights that he went to whine to his father, who was one of the nobles. The nobles burst his bubble by telling him they didn't have a choice since Black Edge was their best option to defend Orvelia, and his father agreed as well. The next day, Tam went into the city and was surprised to see that everyone in town was being nice to him because of Black Edge's help in slaying demons, and he decided to take the W, but in an alley, some armed humans blocked his path. He resisted the urge to take them down when he remembered Rahit's orders, so he ran instead. Soon he got cornered and douchebags injured him and kicked him to the ground, but before they could finish him off, his Black Edge comrade saved him and scared them off. The comrade noticed that he had a fever, and a nice human girl Tam met at a bread shop offered to call a doctor, but he declined, saying they didn't want to cause trouble before carrying Tam away. When they got to the Black Edge hideout, Rahit commended Tam for holding back, and when Tam made fun of the humans that attacked him, Rahit realized that they were sent by Zero. Milam speculated that Zero was jealous of Rahit, and Rahit said that Zero succeeding with his plans of driving Black Edge out would be bad for their plans, so Milam said he'd alert the nobles while Rahit looked for evidence. The next day, Rahit told Scarlet about the incident, and she apologized before Zero dropped by and trolled him. When Rahit returned to the Black Edge base that evening, Ripine showed him the blade of one of Tan's attackers, and he instantly recognized the crest on the blade as Zero's, so he rushed out. A while later, Rahit, accompanied by Ripine, intercepted Zero's moving wagon and scared the crap out of him until he confessed. Rahit then unsheathed his sword, but before he could split that piece of trash in two, Zero's father jumped out and begged for him to spare his son, so Rahit warned them to stay away from his friends. When they got back to their base, Tan thanked Rahit for doing Batman shit on his behalf, and Rahit assured him that those bozos won't bother them anymore. Sometime later, Rahit and Ripine stared at the stars, and Ripine remembered how she was bawling her eyes out after some Orvelians killed their mom, and back then Rahit promised that he'd get revenge for their mom. Back in real time, Ripine said they'd come far, and Rahit looked at a mysterious item as he agreed. Sometime later, Cleo and the Airhead crew were walking through a forest and goofing off as usual when a weird little girl popped out from one of the bushes and stared at them before running away. Eventually, they made it to a village nearby where they met a guy named Hendel, who introduced himself as the mayor of the village before telling them that his building used to be a community hall but was now a shelter. Kaisel asked what happened, so he explained that a nearby town was attacked by demons, so the people escaped into their village. Frey saw a lady get injured while trying to lift a log, so she healed her, and Hendel was pleased to find out that she was a priestess. He told them that the villagers were working together to build new houses, but pointed out that they lacked manpower, so Frey offered to help along with the team. Sometime later, Frey met some little girls in the shelter and helped them braid their hair, and soon the mysterious little girl from the forest walked into the room. Frey tried to start up a conversation with her, but the little girl ran away, so one of the little girls around told Frey that the mystery girl's name was Elise, and she didn't talk or laugh with anyone. Frey asked about her parents, but the girl said they weren't in the area and implied that they may be dead. Meanwhile, Elise was in the garden admiring some flowers when Frey came by and embraced her, while using her magic to try to make her feel better. The rest of the Airhead crew were already making plans to split when Frey arrived, and begged them to stay for the night to fulfill what she called a selfish desire of hers, so they agreed. Pendle was pleased to hear that they were staying over, and when Frey offered to play with the kids, he agreed and said it was great since the parents around couldn't find time to play with the kids. Frey met up with the little ones in a room and suggested they made something called a wreath, and the girls didn't know what it was, so she took them outside and made a circular weave of flowers which she said they could wear or hang on top of their doors. They asked her to teach them, so Frey sent them to get some flowers, and soon Frey went to give Elise a personal lesson on making wreaths, but she ran off. A while later, Frey asked the girls to draw up some pictures, and when a little girl tried to borrow one of Elise's crayons, she smacked her hand, and when Frey tried talking to her, she ran off again. Kaisel was outside, proving himself to be the ultimate wood-chopping machine, when he saw Elise staring at some yellow flowers. Frey came outside and asked Elise what was wrong, before noticing that Elise was drawing the very flowers she was staring at, so she asked if she liked the flowers. Elise said her mom likes the flowers, and when Frey asked what happened to her mom, Elise said the demons killed her mom before crying out loud while Frey embraced her. Sometime later, Frey and Elise used those yellow flowers to bake up some snacks, which they served to everyone at the shelter, and they all loved it and asked her to make more of it for them later. Afterwards, Frey watched proudly as she saw Elise socializing with the other little girls at the shelter for the first time. That evening, Handel praised her for helping Elise open up, and then he asked her to stay over at their village. He added that she could help mend the hearts of many people in that village if she stayed, and he asked her to think about it while Cleo, who was eavesdropping, freaked out. That evening, Frey went to check on the kids, and Cleo told the guys that the mayor tried to recruit Frey, and they all said Frey wouldn't abandon them, because she was a precious companion of theirs. Meanwhile, Frey went to tuck Elise in, but Elise suddenly woke up and begged her to stay. The next day, Handel and the rest of the adults said their goodbyes to the airhead crew, and afterwards Elise took Frey into a barn room and locked her in from the outside. Frey tried to convince her to open the doors, but Elise told her to stay with them forever and ran away. Afterwards, Kaisel went to find Frey, and he met Elise along the way. When he asked about Frey, she took him to the barn where she was locked. But on the outside, they were attacked by a worm demon. Kaisel tried desperately to attack it, but the slithery sucker dodged all his strikes by hiding underground. Frey, who was watching the struggle from the barn, heard another worm demon under the ground and tried to warn Kaisel, but he couldn't hear her. She then broke through the barn door and arrived just in time to save Elise from getting swallowed by a worm monster before Kaisel took it out. The second worm monster hid underground, and Frey saw that Elise was feeling down, so she comforted her, but when she looked in Elise's eyes, she remembered how she met Kaisel. When the worm monster attacked again, Frey claimed they'd never lose to demons, and she pushed it back with a blast before Kaisel finished it off. Afterwards, they met up with the villagers and said their goodbyes to them after telling them about the demons, while Frey made a promise to Elise to return one day so they could make more snacks. On their way out of the village, the Airhead Quartet played around together and ate up a bunch of tasty cookies together. Few days later, the team arrived at a town that had been ravaged by demons, and they spotted a certain man standing afar, which Cleo said she was getting strange vibes from. Kaisel, being a typical half-wit, threw all caution into the wind and approached this man, but before the man could attack him, Roy took the stranger down the most Jackie Chan-esque kick ever, and told Kaisel that he was an undead. The undead man got up again, but before he could attack again, Roy slashed his head off. Soon they noticed they were surrounded by undead, and when they got a weird signal from a stranger, they all ran towards him. But Cleo lacked basic cardio ability, so she had to create a wall of fire to keep the zombies back. Soon, they met up with the stranger at his home and thanked him for his help, so he introduced himself as Johann and told them that the undead reacted to loud noises. Roy asked him why the undead were in the area, so Johann explained that his village was once attacked by demons, and the demons turned the corpses of the victimized villagers into undead, which killed everyone in the village other than himself. He explained that he was the sole survivor because he was smart enough to stack up food and resources in his bunker when the undead attacked. Then Frey saw the yellow flowers which Elise admired and called her name. So Johann freaked out and said Elise was his daughter before asking how she's doing. Frey assured him that she was fine, and they decided to take him to see her, but Johann said he couldn't leave that village. When Johann asked what brought them into the village, they told him they were making their way to the Ogria mountain, so he told them to crash at his place for the night and offered to show them the way the next day. That night, Kaisel asked what undead were, so Roy and Cleo explained that they were moving corpses which the demons could control. And when Frey thought about helping the undead villagers, Roy said there was no way to fix them. Cleo suggested they go out to slay all the undead, but Roy told her they needed to focus on acquiring the holy sword. Later that night, Kaisel snuck out of his room and saw that Johann had been keeping Elise's mom, Lisa, who was now an undead, in the basement. Kaisel shared what he'd learnt with the team, and despite his attempts to be a Boy Scout and let the creep get away with keeping an undead, Roy suggested they question Johann. When Johann came out from the basement, they asked him about the undead in the basement, so he explained that Lisa was killed, so he captured her corpse and kept her there. Then he acted paranoid as he suggested that Lisa was only sick and not dead, but Roy told him there was no way to bring her back. Johann said he couldn't leave Lisa, so Frey asked him about Elise, but he still suggested he had to be with Lisa. Kaisel then gave him a pep talk about how family is important and encouraged him to go see Elise, so he asked for a moment alone with Lisa. He tried having a conversation with the zombie about Elise, but Lisa broke free from one of her arm restraints and scared the crap out of him. After the guys helped him tie her back up, Roy told him he didn't have any choice but to put her to rest by impaling her neck, so Johann freaked out. Then a horde of undead came by the house, so the team ran out to face them. Johann cried as he said the zombie wasn't Lisa since it didn't remember Elise, so he slashed its neck. On the outside, Cleo blasted many of them with flame magic before Kaisel joined the fight and slashed a couple of them down while claiming he'd protect everyone. Back at Orvelia, Black Edge returned after a successful demon raid, and all of them were stunned to see that they were getting praised by the people instead of getting the usual scorn. Ophelia remembered what happened to her mother and said she wished for Orvelians to die, but Tam decided to go look for the girl who helped him when he was attacked. He went to the bread store where he first saw her, but the baker said she wasn't there before directing him to the confectionery where she worked. Rahit met up with Claus at the knight's headquarters, and Claus thanked him for saving Kaisel and Frey, but Rahit said he didn't know who they were. Meanwhile, Scarlet met her father in bed and told him about the Black Edge and how the knights had been working with them. He warned her to be careful around the Dark Elves, so she told him not to worry about her before wishing him better health. After she left the room, Demian noticed she was pale and advised her to get some rest, but Scarlet said she couldn't because the day of Lee was approaching. Afterwards, they reminisce about a time in the past when Scarlet motivated Demia to leave her rich girl life and join the Knights, and Demia said that back then sworn an oath to become Scarlet's shield. Then Rahit showed up, and Scarlet said she needed to talk to him, so she dismissed Demia. Meanwhile, the lover boy Tam hovered around the girl's shop like a helpless bee until a bunch of kids stopped by and forced him into the shop to meet her. Elsewhere, Scarlet told Rahit about how her father sacrificed himself to defend the people against all threats, and how she intended to look after the people of the kingdom since the nobles only cared about themselves. Afterwards, they bonded for a bit before she asked why he fought demons for them, so he replied that killing demons was all they could do. At the same time, Tam returned the girl's handkerchief and asked for her name, so she introduced herself as Sheila. Afterwards, he told her he'd recovered from his injuries and bragged about how he'd have smoked those attackers if he was serious, so she offered to treat him to some homemade snacks, which he graciously accepted. The next day, Scarlet rallied the knights about the upcoming war on the Day of Lead before asking for some opinions on how to stop the Dark Lord. Rahit suggested they investigate the Galoa Plains, where they believed the Dark Lord would respawn from, and Scarlet said they needed to go as a big group, so they decided that the Black Edge would join the expedition. Sometime later, Sheila gave Tam some cakes, and they flirted for a bit before he ate them up and told her they were delicious. When Tam got back to the Black Edge hideout, he was brutally questioned about his meetings with Sheila by one of his comrades, but when Rahit came back and heard what happened, he said he trusted Tam and advised him to make the right move. Afterwards, Tam had a talk on the outside with Ripine and told her he appreciated being loved by the people as well as Sheila, and asked her if she desired happiness beyond their revenge quest. Ripine narrated how her brother took care of her since the day their mother died, which made her decide to help her brother no matter what. She then asked if he could forgive the people of Orvelia because of his love for Sheila and threatened to kill him if he got in Rahit's way. The next day, Tam met up with Sheila and gave her some flowers for a cake before explaining to her that he hated his birthday because when he was young, Orvelian soldiers killed his family on that day. Sheila then asked why he fights the demons for Orvelia, but Tam replied that he didn't do it for Orvelia, but added that he intended to change the world into a world without suffering. On a mountain somewhere, Maria met up with Malduk, who told her how hyped up he was about bringing calamity upon the human race once again. He then remembered a time in the past when he discovered that the princess of the Republic of Grey named Jane had fallen in love with a knight named Theo, and he chewed them out when he caught them saying romantic things to each other. Back then, the king died, so Malduk used his powers of forbidden magic to bring him back, and Theo threatened to exile him for defiling the king. He boasted about it and called himself a god, but Theo wasn't having any of that, so he forcefully exiled Malduk. Afterwards, Malduk felt bitter and desired to bring hell on earth, so the humans would experience terror. Back in real time, Malduk was still going on about his goals, so Maria offered to help him bring the Dark Lord back. Elsewhere, Kaisel and the gang reached Orc territory and saw an Orc shaman named Kala, as well as his underling named Dale, fighting some undead Orcs, so Kaisel jumped in to help them. Kaisel saved Kala by chopping down a huge Orc zombie, and Cleo used her fire shower spell to destroy all the surrounding undead Orcs. Afterwards, Kala thanked Kaisel and the gang, and when Dale tried to stop them from entering Orc lands even further, Kala told Dale that he'd been expecting them, so they said a prayer and let them in. Kala later explained to the team that he knew Kaisel was coming because he got word from ancestral spirits in his dream about how Kaisel would bring hope to the world in a future chaos. Kaisel then requested to see Iatola, the Orc chief, in order to undo the seal on the holy sword, but Kala said Iatola was already 6 feet under, but added that the current chief Sieg could have received instructions from Iatola concerning the matter. When Kaisel requested to meet Sieg, Dale said that Saig forbade humans from entering their lands due to a past incident where a sorcerer turned their people into undead. Kaisel, however, still insisted on meeting Saig, so Kala decided to take him to the chief, and said that he'd fight to protect him if Saig went bonkers and attacked them. Dale tried to convince him otherwise, so Kala explained that he needed to help the heir of the Holy Sword as he was instructed in the dream. Kala, however, said that he could only go into their land with Kaisel, because if he went in with multiple humans, the Orc people could lose their shit, so the gang agreed to stay outside and wait. After Kaisel left with Dale and Kala, the team goofed off at the entrance, but then some other Orcs showed up and tried to attack them. But Cleo and Frey talked them out of it, but then they saw that Cleo had drawn some trash on one of their runes, so they got mad again. Meanwhile, Kala introduced Kaisel to Chief Saig. And after Kaisel told them his goal, Sag asked for Kaisel to defeat him as a way to prove himself as the heir. Kala, however, suggested that the heir must live, so he offered to fight in his place, but before their fight could start, Kaisel tried using some talk no jutsu to convince him otherwise, but Sag used a tried to crush him with his weapon, and when he saw that Kaisel didn't flinch, he agreed to help Kaisel since he'd confirmed his heroic nature. Sag then directed him to their holy shrine to retrieve something, and added that it was a brutal place that would test him. But then some orcs arrived and introduced the rest of the Airhead crew as a bunch of criminals who defiled their fountain. Sag then said they'd be held hostage, and stipulated that if Kaisel died at the holy shrine, they'd kill his friends as well. Sometime, Kala took Kaisel to the holy shrine, and told him to find a sacred altar where his test would be given to him. Kaisel walked through a dark tunnel, and eventually made it to the altar. But there he heard a voice that asked him to show his heart, and after getting overwhelmed by the voice for a while, he heard a much calmer voice that asked him to show his heart. Then he got transported to a dark realm which had a door, and when he opened the door, he transformed into his younger self and had a bit of mother-son bonding time with the spirit of Arlette. Meanwhile, the guard orcs that captured Kaisel's teammates laughed about the idea of a weasel like Kaisel being the heir, and concluded that he'd die along with his friends. But Cleo opened her loud mouth again, and told them that Kaisel was the true heir since he'd already broken a seal. The guards gave her the silent treatment for a bit, and later informed her and the gang that they were getting moved to a different location. Back at the holy shrine, Kaisel enjoyed more playtime with his mom, while Kala faithfully waited for him at the entrance. Kaisel soon started to remember Arlette's death, and when he loudly told the spirit that his mother was dead, he transformed back into his adult form. The spirit resembling Arlette tried convincing him to stay in that happy memory with her where he didn't have any worries, but Kaisel claimed he needed to get the holy sword, no matter what, so he could save people in danger. Arlette reminded him that he could never see her again if he left, but Kaisel said he didn't want to lose anyone again and left the room. After he woke up in the real world, Kaisel saw the spirit of Chief Ayatollah, who congratulated him on beating his illusions, and said he'd have been trapped in that illusion if he gave in to his desires. Ayatollah then wished him good luck in his future battles, and gave him a special talisman, which he then picked up. Eventually, Kaisel returned with Kala to meet Chief Sag, and when Kaisel gave Sieg the talisman, the chief used it to undo the Holy Sword's second seal. Cleo once again pestered Kaisel with questions about whether he could feel himself becoming a Super Saiyan, but he said he couldn't feel anything. However, Malduk, who was miles away, could feel his power, and the Dark Wizard instantly realized it was the Holy Sword's power. Sieg advised Kaisel to remember his experience at the shrine and become a stranger warrior, before promising to fight by his side when the time comes, the same way Ayatollah did for King Kyle. Sieg's parting words were interrupted when Malduk showed up and asked for the Holy Sword. Malduk then introduced himself as the one who created the undead orcs that attacked their land, and when Sieg tried to attack him, he stopped the chief in his tracks with a massive dark blast. When Sieg got back up, Malduk finished him off with another dark blast, so Kaisel and the gang charged towards him at once. Malduk easily dodged the others' attacks, but when he crossed weapons with Kaisel, he felt the Holy Sword's power. After a bit of a brawl, Kaisel managed to cut off a few strands of Malduk's hair, so Malduk got pissed off and fired a massive dark blast that took out Frey. When Malduk started gloating, Kaisel got engaged and attacked him relentlessly, but he dodged all Kaisel's strikes. Kaisel dodged his blasts as well, and soon had him cornered. Kaisel started glowing, so Malduk noticed the power surge and escaped into a dark portal, so Kaisel's attack caused an explosion that took himself out. Kaisel's quest for the Holy Sword's power is looking really hard, isn't it? Well, for you it's much easier, because all you need to do is hit that like and subscribe button.